You don't need to change your life right now. That's the part most people get wrong. Nothing is broken. Nothing is falling apart. You're still functioning, still showing up, still doing what needs to be done. And that's exactly why this matters. Because when something is truly wrong, it's obvious. You react, you adjust, you move. But this isn't that. This is what happens when life keeps working, while something inside quietly stops moving. You don't feel lost. You don't feel confused. You don't feel like you've failed. You just feel slightly delayed, as if everything is happening a half step after it should, as if decisions take more energy than they used to, as if time feels heavier without a clear reason. Most people assume this means they need motivation, or discipline, or clarity. They don't. What's happening is subtler than that. There is a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, where you start adjusting instead of responding. And the adjustment feels smart, responsible, even mature, so you don't question it. You tell yourself you'll deal with it later, when things slow down, when timing makes more sense. But here's the part most people miss. Later isn't neutral. Later has a cost, not a dramatic one, a gradual one. You don't lose everything, you lose precision. You lose that clean sense of this is it, that immediacy that used to guide you without effort. And because nothing collapses, you keep going. That's why you don't notice the moment it starts. That's the part that matters. You don't notice the moment it starts. That's the part that matters, not because it's dramatic, not because something breaks, but because nothing does. You keep moving. You keep responding. You keep doing what you did yesterday, and somewhere inside something small tightens. So small it barely registers. Not pain, not fear, just a slight internal adjustment. And you make it without thinking. Most people think the danger comes from big mistakes, from obvious wrong turns, from loud moments where everything collapses. But that's not how it usually happens. It happens quietly, in the spaces between decisions, in the way you explain things to yourself. It happens when you tell yourself, this is fine, I'll deal with it later. And you don't realize that later has already been traded for something smaller. Between 10 seconds and now, nothing new has been introduced. No new idea, no belief, no instruction, only recognition. Because you've felt this before, not as a thought, as a sensation, a faint sense that something in you has been negotiating with reality, instead of meeting it. You don't wake up one day and decide to abandon yourself. That would be too obvious. Instead, you start translating. You translate what you feel into what's acceptable. You translate what you want into what makes sense. You translate your timing into someone else's schedule, and each translation feels reasonable, even mature, even intelligent, until one day you realize you're fluent in a language you never meant to speak. Here's the strange part. Nothing outside you forces this. Not really. Life doesn't demand it. Time doesn't threaten you. The world isn't chasing you. It's subtler than that. It's the moment you feel a quiet misalignment and choose not to follow it. Not because you're weak, but because you're adaptive. You learned how to adjust early. You learned how to read rooms. You learned how to anticipate outcomes. And that skill kept you safe until it started costing you something you couldn't name. Every path has a rhythm, not a destination. A rhythm. And when you're aligned with it, things don't necessarily become easier, but they become cleaner. Decisions take less effort. Time feels less heavy. Your perception sharpens. When you're not aligned, the opposite happens. You overthink simple things. You hesitate where you used to move. You feel tired without being tired. Not burned out, not depressed, just dulled, as if your inner signal has been turned down slightly. There's a reason this becomes clearer later. Not because it's hidden, but because you're finally quiet enough to notice it. Most people misread this phase. They think it means they need motivation, or discipline, or clarity, so they push harder. They add effort to a misaligned direction and call it growth. But effort doesn't correct direction. It only amplifies it. And this is where time becomes deceptive, because nothing explodes right away. Weeks pass, months pass. You're still functioning, still performing, still doing okay, but something keeps getting postponed, not externally, internally. There's a version of you that notices earlier, a version that doesn't argue with the signal, doesn't analyze it, doesn't explain it away. That version doesn't panic either. It simply pauses. But most people don't pause there. They override. They tell themselves stories that sound responsible. Now isn't the right time. I just need to get through this phase. It'll make sense later. And those sentences work. They work so well that you forget you're the one who said them. Here's a subtle truth. Reality doesn't punish misalignment. It reflects it. When you move slightly off your internal path, the reflection doesn't scream. It whispers. It shows up as repetition, as delay, as friction that doesn't quite justify itself. The same patterns, the same conversations, the same almosts. Not because you're failing, because you're choosing familiarity over resonance. At some point, you stop asking certain questions, not consciously. You just don't go there anymore. You don't ask, is this still true for me? Do I actually want this? Does this version of me still fit? Those questions feel disruptive, so you replace them with smoother ones. How do I make this work? How do I optimize this? How do I stop feeling restless? And just like that, perception narrows. This is how identity quietly solidifies, not through intention, through repetition. You repeat responses, you repeat roles, you repeat explanations, and identity becomes a habit, a useful one, until the field around you starts reflecting a version of you that feels older than you are. Here's something rarely noticed. When alignment is lost, awareness doesn't disappear. It relocates. It moves into observation instead of participation. You start watching yourself live. You hear yourself speak and think, that sounds right, without feeling it. You make decisions that look correct on paper, but don't land in the body. And because nothing is wrong, you assume nothing is. But time doesn't move the same way in misalignment. It stretches. Moments feel heavier. Transitions feel slower. Waiting becomes a background state. You tell yourself you're being patient. But patience feels light. This feels dense. Notice how none of this required effort to follow. That's how recognition works. There's a quiet reason people only realize this too late. Not because the signs weren't there, but because the cost was gradual. You didn't lose everything at once. You lost precision, you lost immediacy. You lost that clean sense of this is it. And because life kept functioning, you kept adjusting. Here's the part that's uncomfortable to admit. You knew, not in words. In timing, in the split second before you said yes, in the hesitation before you replied, in the pause you ignored. That pause wasn't doubt. It was alignment checking in. This becomes easier to see once you stop trying to fix it and simply let it show itself. Most people think choice happens at decision points. It doesn't. Choice happens earlier, at the moment of interpretation, when something feels off and you label it as inconvenience instead of information, when something feels right and you delay it until it cools. Perception is the real fork in the road. Everything else follows. You live inside a field of reflections, not rewards, not punishments, mirrors. The field responds to the version of you that's being broadcast. And broadcasting isn't about intention. It's about coherence. When your inner sense and outer actions align, the signal is clean. When they don't, the signal fractures, and reality reflects that fragmentation as noise. This is why effort without alignment feels exhausting. You're compensating for interference, trying to push a signal through static, and the static isn't external, it's internal contradiction. At some point, people confuse endurance with purpose. They confuse survival with meaning. They say, I'm strong, I can handle it. And they can. That's the problem. Because being able to handle something doesn't mean it's meant to hold you. There are parallel versions of you moving right now. Not metaphorically, experientially. Versions who didn't override that pause, who didn't translate themselves down, who didn't wait for permission to feel congruent. Those versions aren't better, they're clearer. And clarity changes timing. The strange thing is, when alignment returns, nothing dramatic happens either. No fireworks, no announcement, just relief, not happiness, relief. As if you stopped carrying something you forgot was optional. If this feels familiar, it's because you're remembering, not learning. Most people wait for certainty, but certainty is a byproduct of alignment, not a prerequisite. When you're aligned, decisions feel obvious after you make them. When you're not, no amount of thinking produces certainty, only delay. There's a moment, quiet, almost boring, where you stop negotiating with yourself. You stop asking if it's allowed. You stop preparing explanations, and you don't rush either. You simply don't override the signal this time. That's it. That's the moment most people miss because it doesn't feel important. What this reveals later isn't louder, it's cleaner. You don't need to dismantle your life. You don't need to escape anything. Alignment isn't rebellion, it's honesty. And honesty has a specific feeling. It feels unforced. It feels quiet. It feels like things stop arguing inside you. The reason suffering feels personal is because misalignment feels personal. But it isn't punishment. It's feedback. A reflection saying this version doesn't quite match the signal you're sending anymore. And once you see that, the field responds differently, not instantly, but consistently. This is why forgetting is built in. If you remembered alignment all the time, you'd never experience contrast. And contrast sharpens perception. But forgetting too long creates drift. And drift creates a life that looks fine and feels slightly wrong. Some people find language for this in books, some in quiet moments, some in the feeling that led them here. The reason parallel realities resonates with people isn't because it explains anything new. It reminds them of something they already sensed, but didn't trust. There's no finish line to this awareness, no final version, only increasing coherence, cleaner signals, shorter delays, less self-translation. As this continues, something subtle happens. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start noticing, "What am I responding from?" That shift changes everything. The conversation doesn't end here. It keeps unfolding internally, in pauses, in timing, in what you no longer override. And one day you realize you didn't stop anything. You just stopped adjusting away from yourself, and that was enough. You don't wake up one day and decide to abandon yourself. That would be too obvious, too dramatic, too clean. What actually happens is quieter. You begin to adjust. At first it feels harmless, even intelligent. You soften a reaction, you delay a truth, you say later instead of no, and nothing bad happens. So your system learns something dangerous. It learns that ignoring a signal has no immediate cost. That's how the misreading begins. Not as a mistake, as a reinterpretation. You feel a subtle resistance inside you, not fear, not doubt, just a gentle pull in another direction. And instead of following it, you explain it. You tell yourself it's timing, or mood, or immaturity. You don't lie to yourself, you translate yourself. And the translation sounds reasonable. Most people think alignment feels like excitement. It doesn't. Alignment feels like quiet agreement. No rush, no pressure, no internal argument. Misalignment, on the other hand, feels like background noise, a low hum you only notice when it stops. So you keep going. You keep choosing the option that makes the least friction right now. The path that doesn't disturb anyone. The version of you that fits the moment. And again, nothing breaks. Bills get paid, messages get answered, life keeps moving, which makes it even harder to notice what's happening. Here's the strange part. The body notices before the mind does. Your energy drops slightly. Your enthusiasm becomes conditional. You start needing reasons for things that used to feel natural. You call it tiredness, but it isn't. It's signal loss. Reality doesn't react immediately when you drift. It waits. It reflects slowly. Because reflection isn't about punishment, it's about accuracy. When your inner direction and outer movement stop matching, the field around you becomes less responsive. Not hostile, just dull. Opportunities don't disappear, they lose timing. Connections don't vanish, they lose depth. Moments don't collapse, they lose meaning. This is where most people double down. They try harder, they optimize. They push consistency. But effort applied to a misread direction doesn't restore clarity. It increases exhaustion. And because you're capable, you endure. You tell yourself this is what adulthood feels like. That meaning comes later. That clarity is earned through patience. And maybe that's true, but not like this. Because patience doesn't feel like resistance. It feels like trust. The danger isn't that you're on the wrong path. It's that you stop checking. You stop asking if the path is still alive inside you. And the moment you stop checking, identity begins to fossilize. You don't notice the cost right away. You notice it when you suddenly remember how clear things used to feel. Not easier, clearer. And that memory feels oddly personal, almost private, like something you're not supposed to bring up. So you don't. You keep moving, but now you're compensating. And compensation always requires energy. Compensation changes your relationship with time. That's one of the first clues. Time stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling managed. You schedule rest. You justify pauses. You plan moments that used to happen naturally. You don't notice when that shift happens. You just notice that everything now needs a container, even joy. This is where people start saying things like, "I just need a break," or "once this phase passes." And maybe they do need rest. But rest doesn't fix misalignment. It only makes it easier to tolerate. Here's the subtle trap. When you're misaligned, relief feels like alignment. A free weekend, a good conversation, a brief sense of clarity. And because relief feels good, you mistake it for direction. But relief fades. Alignment doesn't. Alignment creates continuity. You might notice this as inconsistency inside yourself. Some days you feel sharp, other days you feel foggy. Not because anything changed externally, because on some days you accidentally stop compensating, and clarity leaks back in. You don't lose alignment all at once. You lose it in increments. Each time you override a pause, each time you choose familiarity over resonance, each time you tell yourself, "This is close enough." Close enough becomes the new standard. The strange thing is, the world responds accordingly, not dramatically, just proportionally. You receive half signals, almost opportunities. Conversations that start strong and dissolve. You call it bad timing, but timing responds to coherence. There's a moment many people remember later, a decision that felt small at the time, not a turning point, not a crisis, just a quiet yes that should have been a no, or a no that should have been a yes. At the time it felt practical, later it feels pivotal. Here's the part that's uncomfortable. You didn't make that choice blindly. You felt the misalignment before the decision, as hesitation, as tightness, as a slight internal pull away, and you chose to override it, not because you were wrong, because you were prioritizing stability. Stability isn't bad, but stability without alignment becomes stagnation, and stagnation slowly distorts perception. You stop trusting subtle signals. You start requiring proof, and proof always arrives too late to guide you. This is how people end up saying, "I don't know what I want anymore." It's not that desire disappeared. It's that perception got trained out of listening. The field you live in is always responding, but it responds to who you're being, not who you think you are. When identity becomes habitual instead of responsive, the reflection dulls. Not to punish you, to signal mismatch. Notice how this isn't about fixing anything. It's about noticing what stopped moving. Most people wait for a moment when misalignment becomes unbearable. They call it burnout, or a crisis, or a breakdown. But by then the signal has been whispering for a long time. They just weren't listening. There's a version of you, quiet, observant, that never stopped listening. It didn't take control. It didn't intervene. It just kept noticing. That's the part of you reading this now, not urgently, just attentively. That observant part of you never argues. It doesn't rush in with solutions. It doesn't demand action. It simply notices when something no longer matches. That's why it's easy to ignore. Urgency gets attention. Subtlety doesn't. At some point you may have noticed a strange shift. You stopped feeling pulled toward things and started feeling pushed away from others. Not excitement, avoidance. You chose based on what drained you less, not what resonated more. That feels practical, but it's also a sign. When alignment is present, choice feels directional. Even uncertainty has movement. When it's not, choice feels defensive. You're not moving towards something. You're minimizing discomfort, and minimization slowly becomes your compass. Here's something most people misunderstand. Misalignment doesn't feel like being off track. It feels like being slightly late, always catching up, always adjusting, as if life started half a step ahead of you. So you speed up, you multitask, you consume more information, you look for frameworks, explanations, systems, anything that promises to restore clarity. But clarity doesn't come from accumulation. It comes from coherence. Coherence is when perception, choice, and identity point in the same direction, not loudly, cleanly, and when that coherence fractures, the mind tries to compensate. It overthinks, it narrates, it justifies. The body, meanwhile, tightens. You might notice this as a loss of internal permission. You hesitate before speaking. You second-guess simple impulses. You wait for cues that never arrive. And slowly, You forget that permission was never external. This is where people start mistaking restraint for wisdom. They say, I'm being careful, I'm being realistic, I'm being responsible. And sometimes they are, but sometimes they're just misaligned. And misalignment always wears a reasonable mask. If this feels uncomfortably accurate, that's not coincidence, that's recognition surfacing. Here's a quiet truth. Reality doesn't respond to what you decide. It responds to what you consistently embody. If you consistently override your internal signals, the field reflects that override as friction, not blocks. Friction. Friction shows up as effort without momentum, motion without progress. You're doing things, sometimes many things, but nothing feels like it's opening. This is often when people say, I feel stuck. But stuck isn't the right word. You're not stuck. You're looping, repeating a pattern that once worked but no longer fits. Loops feel safe, they're familiar, predictable, but they also flatten time. Days blur, weeks compress, memory thins, and one day you realize you've been very busy without feeling very alive. There's no alarm for this moment, no external signal, just a quiet internal noticing. This isn't wrong, but it isn't right anymore. That sentence is alignment trying to re-enter the conversation. Most people answer it with delay. I'll revisit this later, after things settle, when I have more clarity. But clarity doesn't arrive in delay. It arrives in honesty. There's a reason this awareness feels calm instead of urgent. Urgency belongs to fear. Alignment belongs to truth. Truth doesn't chase. It waits. Truth waits because it doesn't need leverage. It doesn't threaten you with consequences. It doesn't bargain, it just stays available. And that's why people mistake it for something optional. There's a subtle moment, almost forgettable, when you realize you're more committed to maintaining a version of yourself than to listening to what's actually happening inside you. You don't say it out loud. You feel it as tension, a sense that changing direction would cost too much explanation. Explanation is expensive, it requires justification, it requires storytelling, it requires managing reactions, so you keep choosing continuity over coherence. And again, nothing explodes, which reinforces the habit. Here's what rarely gets said. Misalignment isn't dramatic because drama would interrupt the pattern. Misalignment is efficient. It lets you keep functioning, and functioning becomes the evidence you're fine. At some point, functioning replaces feeling as your metric. You ask, am I handling things? Instead of, am I connected to what I'm doing? Handling feels productive. Connection feels vulnerable. This is when identity starts feeling heavier. Not because you changed, but because you're carrying a version of yourself that no longer updates. You're protecting an image, even if no one asked you to. The field around you reflects this protection as rigidity. Options feel narrower, conversations feel rehearsed, surprises feel inconvenient instead of interesting. Life becomes something to manage, not explore. Notice how the discomfort here isn't emotional. It's energetic, like something wants to move but can't. Here's the part people fear. Alignment doesn't always preserve what you've built. It preserves what's true, and sometimes those aren't the same thing. So the mind resists, not out of fear of loss, but fear of instability. Instability feels dangerous when you're identified with structure, but structure without alignment becomes a cage, a comfortable one. You might notice a growing impatience with things that once felt fine, small irritations, uncharacteristic frustration, a sense that your tolerance is shrinking. It's not that you're becoming less patient, you're becoming more honest. Honesty sharpens perception, and sharper perception makes misalignment harder to ignore, which is why this phase often feels uncomfortable, not painful, unsettled. This is where many people look outward. They change environments, they change routines, they change inputs. Sometimes that helps, but if the internal signal is still overridden, the pattern follows. Different scenery, same loop. The signal you've been ignoring isn't loud. It doesn't say what to do, it just says, this isn't it, over and over, patiently. There's a moment, brief but precise, when you realize you don't actually want more information. You want permission. Permission to stop compensating, permission to stop translating, permission to let coherence matter again. The truth is, permission was never required, but realizing that is part of the realignment. When permission dissolves, something else takes its place. Simplicity, not ease, not comfort, simplicity. You stop carrying arguments inside you. You stop preparing defenses for choices you haven't even made yet, and suddenly, the internal noise drops, not to silence, to signal. This is usually when people expect something big to happen, a decision, a declaration, a turning point. But that expectation is part of the old pattern. Alignment doesn't announce itself. It resets orientation. You begin noticing what you no longer have to force, conversations that don't require rehearsal, choices that don't need justification, moments where your body relaxes before your mind catches up. Those moments feel ordinary, which is why they're easy to dismiss. Here's the subtle shift. You stop asking, will this work, and start noticing, does this feel clean? Clean doesn't mean safe. It means undivided. No internal splitting, no mental bargaining, just one signal instead of two. When that happens, time behaves differently. Not faster, more responsive. Things don't necessarily arrive sooner. They arrive on time. And on time feels very different from eventually. This is where reality starts reflecting coherence instead of effort. Less friction, fewer delays that make no sense, less need to convince yourself you're moving forward. Not because life got easier, because you stopped sending mixed signals. Notice how alignment feels quieter than ambition. That's how you know it's real. At this stage, people often feel something unexpected. Grief, not for what they lost, but for how long they tolerated dissonance. They realize how much energy went into maintaining a misfit, and that realization stings, briefly. But grief here isn't regression, it's recalibration. The nervous system updating its baseline, letting go of tension it mistook for normal. You may also notice a loss of interest in proving things. You don't need validation the way you used to. You don't need certainty to move. You trust responsiveness more than prediction. That's alignment maturing. This is where parallel versions of you begin to feel closer. Not imagined, felt. As if the distance between who you are and who you could be shrinks, not through effort, through honesty. You don't feel like a new person. You feel like an earlier one, before the translations, before the compensations. Not naive, clear. Reality doesn't reward this. It reflects it. Opportunities feel cleaner. Choices feel lighter. And when something doesn't fit, it's obvious sooner, which saves time. Time was never the enemy. Delay was. And delay was just misalignment stretched across days. One last thing becomes noticeable here. You stop fearing too late, because you realize that too late was never about time. It was about listening. There's a quiet confidence that comes with listening again. Not the kind that announces itself, the kind that doesn't need rehearsal. You notice it in small ways. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't over-explain decisions. You don't argue with clarity when it arrives. Clarity feels final without being rigid. At this point, something important changes in how you relate to choice. You stop treating choice like a gamble. You see it as a response to what's already present in you, which means you don't have to figure out the future. You just have to stop misreading the present. Most people think awareness is about paying more attention. It isn't. It's about paying cleaner attention, less interpretation, less translation, more direct perception. That's why things start to feel simpler. Not because life simplifies, because perception stops cluttering it. You may notice that certain paths simply lose energy, not dramatically. They just don't pull anymore. You don't resist them. You don't close them forcefully. You let them fade. That's alignment choosing for you. This is where the idea of parallel realities stops feeling abstract. You sense that each moment contains multiple directions, not options, directions, and your state of coherence determines which one responds. Notice how this isn't about control, it's about resonance. The field around you doesn't need instructions, it mirrors frequency. When your inner signal stabilizes, the reflection sharpens. Conversations land differently. Timing tightens. Synchronicity feels less surprising, not magical, accurate. At this stage, you might notice a subtle disinterest in urgency-based narratives. Fear doesn't motivate the way it used to. Pressure feels unnecessary. You don't feel superior to it, you just don't respond to it. This is often when people stumble onto language that finally resonates, not because it explains everything, but because it names what they already sensed. That's why parallel realities tends to find people here. Not as instruction, as confirmation, There's also a shift in how you relate to effort. You still act, you still choose, you still move, but you're no longer pushing against yourself, which makes the same actions cost less. You might even notice something unsettling at first. You have more space, and space can feel unfamiliar when you're used to compensation, so you sit with it. You don't rush to fill it. In that space, perception deepens. You start sensing when something is a distraction instead of a direction, and you don't judge it. You just don't follow it. The sense of too late dissolves completely here, because you see that nothing was missed, only delayed. And delay was reversible the moment you listened. There's no finish line to this. That's the part that finally relaxes you. You're not catching up. You're not fixing anything. You're not arriving somewhere new. You're just no longer moving away from yourself. What continues from here isn't intensity. It's subtlety. You notice when something opens instead of when it impresses. You feel when timing is clean instead of when it's urgent. You trust quiet alignment over loud certainty. That trust compounds. Life doesn't suddenly become meaningful. Meaning stops being something you search for. It shows up in coherence, in moments that feel unargued, in decisions that don't echo internally, in paths that don't require persuasion. You may still experience contrast, confusion, pause, uncertainty, but it feels different now. It doesn't threaten your direction, it informs it. This is where awareness becomes less about insight and more about companionship. You're no longer watching yourself from a distance. You're moving with yourself. The world reflects that companionship gently, not through spectacle, through fit. Things fit better. People respond more cleanly. Delays feel informative instead of frustrating. You don't talk about this much. Not because it's secret, because it's personal. It's not something to convince others of. It's something you recognize when it's present. If you reflect back, you might see how long the signal was there, how patient it was, how often it checked in quietly while you learned what it felt like to override it. None of that was wasted. Contrast trained precision. This awareness doesn't close the conversation. It opens it, in pauses, in timing, in the way you no longer rush to answer life. And if there's one thing that remains clear, it's this. You didn't arrive late. You arrived when you stopped misreading yourself. And that shift continues long after this moment ends.